Hello everyone. Welcome back to the Scenestalking podcast. In this episode, we're heading into London to explore the impact of one of the UK's most beloved characters. He sits alongside fellow British icons like Bond and Sherlock Holmes. Please give a round of applause for Paddington Bear.
Stranger danger. Keep your eyes down. There's some sort of bear. Hello.
Hello there.
Mary.
It's a young bear needs our help, Henry. It's just for one night.
Do bears even have names? My name is...
Or perhaps you'd like an English name.
An English name?
Paddington.
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 Paddington? Sorry.
From the producer of Harry Potter.
You've literally just brought home a random bear.
He's much more similar than you think.
From Scotland to the North Yorkshire moors, centralising in London from areas like Primrose Hill, Paddington Station, and the Natural History Museum, these films have played a huge role in shaping how audiences, especially families and international visitors, engage with the city and British culture and values as a whole. The new films, based on the classic character of Paddington Bear, created by Michael Bond, have become sensational among fresh audiences of all ages, with a star-studded cast of British acting prowess. Featured are names like Hugh Bonneville, Jim Broadbent, Hugh Grant, Peter Capaldi and Ben Whishaw, who appeared in Downton Abbey, Harry Potter, Notting Hill, Doctor Who, and the most recent Bond franchise starring Daniel Craig, respectively. I was able to visit one of the most recognisable filming locations of the franchise. You may recognise it as the street where the Brown family, and eventually Paddington, live. This is Chalcot Crescent in the Primrose Hill area of London. The curved, colourful houses of Chalcot Crescent do not disappoint, and I was half expecting to see a Peruvian bear cycle past me on a bicycle. That was for all you marmalade sandwich lovers out there. Instead, I was able to speak to one of the residents, who was fascinated by living on a literal film set.
First, I'm living like in the last floor. I never see Paddington, so I didn't know when we get here. And this is like a student, the 34 is a student building. Yeah, I didn't know about it until I saw the people, and after I start to realize that, yeah, it's Paddington House. But it still is, like, you realize even more when people come, you know, that is a beautiful, an amazing street. I have to watch it.
Wow. What an honour it must be to live on the street that opened their arms to Paddington Bear. And when you go there, actually, it looks like a film set. The colourful houses, and it doesn't look real. It looks so artificial. Folks, today I'm joined by Bethan Jones from Cardiff University, whose research focuses on the economic and cultural impacts of screen tourism. Bethan has published a report on her findings during her time as an academic with the University of York, which can be accessed online. Bethan, thank you so much for joining me today. Before we start, I want to hear more about your screen tourism study at the University of York. This was a study you produced, Screen Tourism, Regional Development, Fan Labour and Sustainability.
Yeah, sure. So I worked as a research associate for the Screen Industries Growth Network at the University of York for a couple of years from 2022 to 2024. And a lot of the work involved looking at skills and training. Because my background, I used to work for Welsh Government. So I was a senior marketing and communications manager in the Department for Education and Skills. And I was working on post-16 stuff, so apprenticeships, Jobs Growth Wales, like React, which was offering support and upskilling for people that be made redundant. So I've got that background in skills and training. So I was employed in York to do work on skills and training specific to film and TV, creative industries. But my research background is fan studies. So I've done a lot of work on fandom. I've looked at things like anti-fandom, hatred online, toxicity, fan fiction, kind of fan productions and all of that sort of stuff. And obviously fan tourism is a really big part of fandom. And I had the chance to apply for some funding through the university, which I did. So I was awarded £10,000 to do some work on screen tourism. And I was interested in looking at it from like a fan studies perspective. So what are the things that fans are doing in these locations? Why are they doing them? What's the impact on fans themselves? But also looking at the economic angle, because there's been a lot of discourse about screen tourism having a big effect on the economy. And Visit Britain, I think it was last year or 2024, because we're not in 2025 anymore. But in 2024, I think it was, they did their Starring Great Britain tourism campaign, so that relied heavily on screen tourism. So I was kind of interested in that. I'd seen it myself, sort of during and after the pandemic, when I'm a Celebrity was filmed up in Greek Castle in Abergele in North Wales, and you had a lot of people kind of go in to Abergele and taking photos of the castle, and one of the pubs did a I'm a Celebrity lunch, and you could, you'd have a burger and there'd be a cricket on this burger and things like that. And that was kind of as we were coming out of the pandemic, so that was really interesting in terms of feeding money into the local economy. So I applied for the funding, I was successful, and I decided to look at 6 specific locations of screen tourism in the UK, because the funding wouldn't let me travel to New Zealand, unfortunately. And I wanted to look at a range of texts, the kind of really old stuff like Last of the Summer Wine, like Heartbeat, through to the newer stuff like Game of Thrones and Harry Potter. And I wanted to look at texts that were quite niche. So The Prisoner, which was filmed in Portmeirion, it only ran for like 1 season in the 60s, but there's still this really active fan community around it, as well as texts that had been cancelled. So Gentleman Jack had been cancelled a few months before I decided to start the research, but there was still a lot of activity around Gentleman Jack being done in Halifax. So I wanted to kind of look at a range of different texts and different locations to see what impact screen tourism was having on them and on the fans.
There's lots to unpick there. It's a huge subject area. Run me through those 6 case studies again.
So there was The Prisoner, which was filmed in Portmeirion, which is a village on the coast of like North Wales. Quite a famous village anyway, because it's built in this kind of Italian style, and it's like really colourful. It's not what you'd expect to see on the coast of North Wales. So that was The Prisoner. It was a science fiction series run in the 60s. There was Gothland, which was used for filming Heartbeat, which was like a police kind of procedural series set in the 60s, that ran, like, I remember watching it on a Sunday night at my grand's house, like, it was running in kind of the 90s, and it's still repeated a lot on telly now as well. So I went there. I did Edinburgh for Harry Potter tourism. Even though Harry Potter was never filmed in Edinburgh, they've kind of jumped on the fan bandwagon. So there's a lot of Harry Potter tourism up there. I went to Belfast because that's where Game of Thrones had been filmed. So I did a couple of kind of walk-in / bus tours. I went to the Game of Thrones studio tour because they've got like a big industry around Game of Thrones. I'm trying to think what else I did. I went to Halifax for Gentleman Jack because it was filmed a lot in and around Halifax. And I went there. There was an event, it's been run for a good few years now by an American fan called Pat Esgate, and it's the Anne Lister birthday week. So they have a load of different events related to Anne Lister, like the real person, and then Gentleman Jack, the fictional series. So again, I did a couple of bus tours, did a couple of walk-in tours, went to Shibden Hall, which they used for filming season 1, although they didn't then use it for season 2 because it was really small. And I went to Holmfirth, which is where Last of the Summer Wine was filmed. And again, that's when I remember watching at my grand's house on a weekend. And it was linked to the 50th anniversary. So it was the 50th anniversary in 2023 or 2024 of Last of the Summer Wine. So a lot of the businesses there were kind of capitalizing on that. So there were a lot of talks in pubs. There were pictures of different characters up in, the estate agent's window and stuff like that. The council had developed a walk-in tour, like a self-guided walk-in tour. So I went on, excuse me, on that. And I went to a couple of like comedy evenings and performances and talks as well. So yes, it was Holmfirth, Gothland, Belfast, Edinburgh, Halifax, and Portmeirion. Those were sort of the 6.
That's fascinating. That just wow, diversity involved. You've been far and wide on your studies, and that's the real essence of screen tourism, I think. It's not just about films, it's about the love of travel too. I really want to know, actually, from you, the cost of living crisis at the moment. One of the main angles of my major project is whether the cost of living has actually majorly impacted the choice in people's travel habits, whether they're going to places because a famous location has been filmed there, or whether they're prioritizing more general travel. So, from you, does the cost of living crisis, do you think, change the type of tourists who travel rather than the overall desire to travel?
To some extent, yes, because travel requires money. And if you're in a cost of living crisis, a lot of people on maybe like the lower end of the social economic scale are not going to have the money to travel. So the people who can afford it are the people who've got money, that tend to be kind of middle upper classes. They're wealthier people. So I think it definitely changes the type rather than the desire. I think we can all say that, yeah, like I really want to go on holiday, but I can't afford it, or I haven't got the money and stuff. The desire is still there. It's just the means to go becomes limited to people that have got the finances to afford it, I think.
Absolutely. Travel as an aspect, separated from screen tourism, is expensive. Believe me, I've done traveling before, and it hasn't been easy. It's taken a lot of money, a lot of effort, a lot of work, a lot of shifts. So, Bethan, in your research, do screen motivated tourists act differently from general tourists when this discretionary spending is under pressure?
So my research hasn't looked specifically at discretionary spending. So I want to kind of highlight that just because it's I haven't got any findings that kind of speak to that either way. But there is a lot of research that's been done by kind of tourism boards. So Visit Hertfordshire was one. They did some stuff around screen tourism, partly coming out of the pandemic. And they did find that, yes, spending went up. I haven't got the figures, but you can definitely find it in their reports online. And we had that kind of in the early 2010s as well, on the back of the financial crisis. There's been research done in screen tourism there, and people were spending money. And I think part of that, and this might speak to some of your later questions, is that screen tourism tends to be pretty accessible, particularly to local people. So if we think about the north of England, for example, York isn't far from Halifax. So you could easily get people going from Halifax to York to go to the church that appeared in Gentleman Jack season 2, because it doesn't cost as much as, flying to the Maldives or whatever. And if you go there, you're going to be buying a cup of coffee, or you might be buying some, souvenirs or something like that, which again tend to be lower value, so like magnets or postcards, things like that. So like I said, I haven't got evidence or data in my own research, but we can see it in other research that's been done around kind of points of maybe economic crisis or the cost of living crisis, where people are still spending money on screen tourism, albeit in small amounts.
Exactly, yeah. If I had a choice, or if I had limited choice, in fact, essentially you're killing two birds with one stone. If you're going to plan a trip, if you're a movie fan, maybe you're just a mild film fan, you're not too big on a particular franchise or film, and maybe you don't even know that it is a film location. A lot of people go to these places and they're not even realizing that Downton Abbey has been filmed here, or Hot Fuzz has been filmed here. Make sure to check out the other episodes, by the way, covering Hot Fuzz, Downton Abbey, Peaky Blinders, and all of these famous filming locations. You go to a place and some people don't even realize there's been a famous production there, and they actually learn about the film from the screen tourism.
Yes.
So in a way, there's like a sort of paradox going on, where if you're not a screen tourist, you go to a place and you learn about the film, then you watch the film. A lot of people become fans from that. Whereas you've got obviously the screen tourists who know about it, who are diehard fans, and it is essentially a great way of it's like a cycle, I suppose, of constantly reinforcing the support and love for a franchise, or a particular franchise or TV series. So yeah, Bethan, my next question then: can screen tourism act as a form of economic resilience during downturns? Or does it simply delay a wider decline, like a more general decline? So can it act as a form of a buffer, I suppose, during times of crisis, like the cost of living crisis? Or does it just delay these things, delay the inevitable?
It definitely can. So I mentioned Abigail and like the I'm a Celebrity screen tourism that kind of came after that. So it was filmed during the pandemic because obviously they couldn't fly to Australia because of the lockdowns. So they went up to Greek Castle, which is owned by an individual, but there's like a Greek Castle Preservation Trust, and they've been trying to do up the castle for years and years and years. So I'm a Celebrity was filmed there. ITV contributed some money to renovations in the castle to make it, or parts of it at least, safe for the celebrities. And obviously the Preservation Trust did, once it appeared on telly, they did a lot of marketing, like, oh, I'm a Celebrity was filmed here, and you can come up to the castle and sit in the I'm a Celebrity box, or whatever it is, and that encouraged a lot of people. There was one incident where it's quite a tragic one, that a woman was killed. She was standing on the road taking photos of the castle, and she got hit by a car, which isn't, it's not nice. It's not a great thing, but she was from out of the area, and a lot of people were coming from out of the area. And it caused a bit of controversy because at that point, Wales had different lockdown rules to England. So there were people coming over the border from England into Wales where we were being told to socially distance. And that caused, a lot of political kind of controversy and some issues and stuff. But you were having people going into the village and buying things, like I said, going to the pub and having this I'm a Celebrity meal with a grasshopper and things like that. And they were local kind of businesses that had been not recruited, but employed by ITV or contracted by ITV to create the clothing, so the branded clothing, and bus companies would ferry the celebrities to and from where they were staying to the castle, which is kind of tangential to screen tourism. Like, that element is more related to the production side of things. But that can improve, that can bring money into the environment, which then drips down into screen tourism because you've got people coming in. Like I said, on the back of a pandemic, when they couldn't travel anywhere, they were going to North Wales to see the castle where I'm a Celebrity was being filmed.
That's right, yeah, because it was being filmed in Wales during the COVID-19 pandemic. I remember that. Seemed strange. It's a different place, different location, not what I'm used to seeing on TV. So, Bethan, how useful then is counterfactual thinking in screen tourism research? So, asking kind of like what places would look like without screen exposure.
It's a bit of a tricky one because how do we prove a negative? So if these places hadn't been visited by screen tourism, I mean, we've got some of the economic data that we can look at and kind of say, okay, well, this tourism report tells us that in 23-24 there was a 20% increase in the number of visitors, and at the end of 2019 or whatever, this program aired. So there's kind of we can infer that the program led to the screen tourism. How do you do that in reverse? So like if there's a village or a town or something that hasn't appeared in screen tourism, like, we can't say what the impact of that screen tourism would have been. I don't know. I don't think that kind of counterfactual thinking is massively useful, because there's a lot why locations might be chosen for screen tourism as well. So it might be things like access. How easy is it for the cast and the crew and the lorries and the production teams and the buildings to be done there? So that might be a reason why screen tourism doesn't happen in one location and it happens elsewhere. And I don't know, I kind of feel like it's difficult to tell. Like I said, we can kind of do it backwards, so we can look at the figures and kind of go, okay, well, this age year in 2019, in 2020, we had, a tenfold increase in visitors. And you can kind of say, okay, well, if that film hadn't been screened here, we wouldn't have had that uptick in visitors. But I don't know, I feel like we need to look at all of the data. So like the tourism reports, speaking to businesses in the kind of location that's being used, because there's also, it's not just the economic elements. There's potential issues around like the culture of the place, or the environmental impact. So like thinking about Freshwater West, in Pembrokeshire, that's where Dobby's grave is. So in the last Harry Potter film, we kind of see Dobby's grave, and Obviously, socks are really, relevant to Dobby because he was given the sock and that made him free. So fans go and kind of leave socks there, or that they might leave laminated letters, or they might paint pebbles and stuff. And actually, that's really bad for the environment there because it's a special scientific interest. So actually, without that screen exposure, that place would probably be in a better position because there wouldn't be so many people traipsing all over it and moving rocks from the shoreline up into the beach.
Interesting that. It's not all benefits. There are obviously, with increased footfall, I suppose it's natural to, ironically natural, for people to commit those sort of atrocities, I guess, against the environment, littering and disturbing the natural environment, habitats. Yeah, there's a massive environmental impact to consider when analysing screen tourism, absolutely. Would you say there's evidence to suggest screen tourism becomes more important during economic crises as people, I suppose, prioritise meaningful or emotionally driven trips?
That's an interesting question because, like, a lot of the data we've got about why screen tourism is important during economic crisis is the economic one. So it's a local trip. It's easier to for people to get to. It's more like a staycation than a vacation kind of thing. But that does preclude a lot of the fan attachment to these places. Like for a lot of fans, places like Freshwater West are really meaningful. And they are driven by that affective engagement that fans have with the text. Like I said, my research, it didn't specifically focus on times of economic crisis, so it's a bit trickier to answer that. But certainly, screen tourism as a whole, is driven by fans' engagements with the text. They go to these places because they're meaningful. And Halifax is a really, really good example of that. So I went up there, like I said, for the Anne Lister birthday week. It's run by Pat Esgate. She's a fan. She's also a lesbian. There were a lot of lesbians attending this event because Anne Lister was a lesbian. And I think it was the first night, there was an event in one of the churches in Halifax. And people were talking about why they came and why Gentleman Jack was so important to them. And the number of people that stood up, and these were women in like their 60s, in their 70s, and they were standing up saying, all my life I have felt like there's something wrong with me. And Gentleman Jack showed me that wasn't the case. There were a couple of women were like, yeah, I was married because I thought that's what I had to do, and I was really unhappy, and then I got divorced and I thought about killing myself, but then I watched Gentleman Jack. So that element of screen tourism is always going to be important. I think potentially we could make the argument that it's more important during economic crises because people are struggling with other things as well. So having that attachment to a particular location that you've seen on TV, or you read in a book, if we broaden it to media tourism, I think we could make that argument, but I haven't got any data that backs that up beyond the fact that these places are meaningful.
Just absolutely fascinating, isn't it? Just the emotional connection someone can have with this filming location, how the film has given them the confidence and spoken to them in an emotional way. It's a massive consideration when analysing talking screen tourism. Absolutely. It's incredible to hear that, actually. So really going back into the economic side of things, do screen tourists sustain a healthy level of income as well as visitor numbers, or is there potentially a risk of high footfall with a lower economic return?
Yes, I think they can definitely sustain income. So when I was in Holmfirth, for example, for the Last of Summer Wine anniversary weekend, there were tons and tons of people there. I was surprised, given how old Last of Summer Wine is, how many people were there. But you had people going on like the bus tour. So there's a vintage bus that does like a tour of different locations. There's a tea room, and that was doing a roaring trade. There were two actually. So there's Sid's Calf, which is in the show, and you can kind of, it's done up in real life as it was in the show. So they were doing a roaring trade, like they were selling drinks and food and stuff, but also merchandise linked to Last of Summer Wine. So they'd sold out of a couple of t-shirts when I popped in. There was another tea room across the river that was also doing a really good trade. There was the Last of Summer Wine Museum, and there were quite a few people, including families that were going around when I was in there. And these people typically probably wouldn't have gone to Home Firth. Or I was going to say, if it wasn't for the festival, they may have gone, but they wouldn't have gone in such crowds, because there were scores and scores of people there. And then obviously they're staying in local accommodation, so that's going back into the economy. They're eating at local restaurants and pubs, so that's going back into the economy. They're drinking in local cafes and pubs, so that's all going back into the economy. So it definitely can and does sustain income to an area as well. I mean, there's always the risk that people aren't going to spend a lot of money, but some of that I think depends on the location as well. So thinking about Freshwater West, I'm going to go back to that because it's a really good example. It's a beach, like there's nothing there. So there's high footfall that potentially does environmental damage, but there's kind of a low economic return because there's nothing to buy on Freshwater West. It may be that people are going to stay in Pembrokeshire, so that then feeds into the local economy as part of a wider holiday potentially, because it's quite an awkward place to get to. So you generally kind of maybe wouldn't do a day trip to Freshwater unless you lived in southwest Wales. So people may bring it into part of a larger holiday, and then they're bringing in, more economic return. But for Freshwater itself as a location, yes, it's going to be high footfall with no economic return because it's on a beach and there's nothing to buy there.
Absolutely. Location is important from the desolate to populated urban areas. Do you think the cost of living crisis then has exposed some over-reliance on screen tourism, perhaps, in certain locations?
I don't necessarily think so. I think part of that is because it's only fairly recently, like I said, I think in 24, that Visit Britain started pushing screen tourism locations as a marketing tool. And that's kind of coming out of the pandemic. And we're not going to see the evidence of that for, another year or two at least. So it's kind of difficult to tell yet because we don't have the data from these specific times of economic crisis. Certainly, I mean, in Abergele, people were on the whole really pleased to have people coming in rather than saying, oh my God, we're relying on this too much. But then Abergele is a very small place that you wouldn't normally go and visit as a tourist. Edinburgh, on the other hand, I think is really fed up of Harry Potter tourism up there. I mean, when I went up there were about 6 Harry Potter walk-in tours taking place, and I think 5 of us were in Greyfriars Kirkyard at the same time. So that's a lot of people in a really, really small space, kind of gathered around the same, graves and stuff. And it does get frustrating for locals. So potentially for certain destinations, for the well-known destinations, potentially it can be a problem, and there is that over-reliance there. I'm trying to think if it's an issue elsewhere. It wasn't an issue in Home Firth. It wasn't a massive issue in Gothland where Heartbeat was filmed. A couple of people living there that I spoke to were a bit like, oh yeah, it's really annoying. We've got people coming up here all the time. But I was there for a specific Heartbeat like vintage weekend, so people would be there with their vintage cars and maybe screen used cars and stuff. There is an interesting article actually. So the guy who used to own the post office in Gothland was like really, really keen on it and used to have loads of like screen used props and stuff in the window and sell postcards and everything. Then the post office got taken over by someone else and they got rid of all of the Heartbeat stuff, and they were complaining about people coming up here and wanting to take a photo of the post office and not buying anything. But that seemed to be like an outlying opinion. Most people in Gothland were like, yeah, why would they come to us otherwise? So it could be, it could have exposed some issues in terms of over-reliance for certain destinations, but definitely not all of the destinations.
Unfortunately, we've reached the end of our podcast today. Bethan, thank you so much for joining me. Your insights have added a really valuable academic perspective, actually, to the discussion around screen tourism. Big shout out to our listeners. Thank you for tuning in. Now, if you're a fan of the gritty crime dramas with a bit of history chucked in, You won't want to miss our next episode. That's right, folks, we're heading straight into the Black Country culture. And how Birmingham has been shaped by the smash hit series Peaky Blinders, with our special guest being the founder of the Peaky Blinders tours to offer an insight into how his business has boomed as a result of the show's global fame. We'll be live with Edward Gostick next week here on Scenestalking. Better not miss it by the order of the Peaky Blinders. Until then, bye for now.